about the second tithe. And we need to recognize that the concept of stewardship really began in Eden as a responsibility assigned to Adam and Eve. It's expressed by the Hebrew word radah. In the New Testament, uses the Greek word oikonomia. There is a great difference between the Hebrew word and the Greek word, because the Hebrew word is a verb, and the verb have the action. But here in the New Testament, we have a noun. So that make really the difference. So we as Adventists use more our concept based in the Old Testament. The Protestant churches use more the New Testament. Coming to the Christian era, we observe that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the imperial army under leadership of Titus is affected by the religious practices of Judaism. Before the destruction of Jerusalem temple, the Jewish people dedicated a first tithe to support the Levites. In Hebrew, the word is maser, and maser means only 10%. Is the meaning. And here is the biblical reference where appear that reference at the what we call Levitical tithe. But they also dedicated a second tithe for charity and the annual feast in Jerusalem. This means that for us it's better to study all financial plan for Judaism, not only study the first tithe or the second tithe, but all the package. Is what I'm going to do this afternoon. The second tithe was dedicated to charity and the annual feast in Jerusalem, and the biblical reference is here. Now, the expression second tithe doesn't appear in the Bible, in the Old Testament. But how we know there is talking about the second tithe is because the biblical reference explain the different use in relation with the first tithe. Now, for this part, we need to explain some things. The Hebrew system has 7 years cycle, and such laws apply to the first 6 years of the 7, because you know the 7 was Shabbat, or was not cultivated the land. This was part of the 7-year cycle in which the land was dedicated to planting and harvesting for the first 6 years. In the 7th year, any product of the land was to be dedicated to the poor. Now, how we make difference about the different tithes? Well, the first tithe, that is the tithe for Levite, the use refer as a maser rishon. That tithe is given every year of the all 7 years. For the second tithe was called maser sheni. But maser sheni means that second tithe can use it also for feasts and charity. And that distribution apply in the first, second, 4, and 5 years of the cycle. In the year third and sixth, the second tithe for charity is called Maserani. So you can see that is not confusion in the language to clarify the distinction. Now, some Protestant writers sometimes mention that the Jew has 3 tithes, but really is not right, because the second tithe was applied in one way in some years, in another way in the other years. Why the Maserani in years 3 and 6? Well, in those years, the second tithe was used 100% for charity. That's the difference. In the previous year, 1, 2, 4, 5, it can use for feasts in Jerusalem and charity. But at the year third, in the year 6, was 100% for charity. Now, offerings for sanctuary, they call minha, and apply all the years. With this clarification, we can continue. Many or several laws were no longer observed by Jews after the destruction of the second temple. Why? Because they affirmed that the first tithe for the Levites was an express and direct order from God that should be for the Levites. So after the destruction of the temple and destruction of the city, automatically the Jews until today are not giving the first tithe, but they are continue faithfully with the second tithe and offerings. What was the purpose of the second tithe? This is explained in the book of Patriarchal Prophets by Ellen G. White, chapter 51, entitled God's Care for the Poor. Ellen G. White is calling attention to taking care of the poor, the fatherless, the widow, and the stranger. Now, in this book, you are going to find reference that the majority of the Jews give 25% of the income, and a few give 1/3. When this reference was given, was to emphasize the convenience to take care of the poor. Concerning the first tithe, the Lord had declared, I have given the children of Levi the tenths in Israel. But in regard to the second, he commanded, 2 shall eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name. So this is a clear difference between one and the other. Every third year, however, this second tithe was to be used at home in entertaining the Levite, the poor, and Moses said that they may eat within thy gates and be filled. This tithe will provide a fund for the uses of charity and hospitality. In order to get the right message, we must read the entire chapter and take into account the historical context. Because this quotation was written by Ellen G. White when the church was applying the systematic benevolence as a weekly offering. Okay, weekly offering between 1859 to 1876. And some of our members who signed the promise to give, for example, 5 cents weekly, another give 10 cents, they were not fulfilling that promise. They give it the offering 1 week and the other not do it. So in this particular situation, they need to consider the advice of the spirit of prophecy that the system was not so heavy, was not difficult in order to be faithful and show the example in the Jewish culture. For that, it's convenient to read the entire chapter, not only the selected quotation. Israel's system of tithe and offerings designed by that include three components. Number one, the first tithe went to the maintenance of the Levites and was administered by the Levites. This is number one. Number two, the second tithe was intended to support the annual fees and personal charity and was administered by the Hebrew family. Second tithe was not for the sanctuary. That's why when we use this biblical quotation in order to get more money to support our local church, we are taking the quotation out of the framework. Now, I believe in this plan. I believe in this plan. And let me tell you, when I learned for the first time was in 1969. That was the time when they elect me as a stewardship departmental. I believe in this plan. I have been practicing this plan since 1969. I'm going to explain how. Number two, okay, we explained it already. Number three, the offering were part of the worship and support the operation of the sanctuary. And the offering is mostly 5% of the tithe. We must remember that by the year 1445, before Christian era, you know, we call before Christian era is in the Adventist jargon, but in the Protestant they say before common era. That's the agreement. We must remember that by that year, 1445, when the people of Israel gathered at Mount Sinai to receive instruction as to how things should work in Israel in the civil, moral, social, economic, and religious component of society, there was no social security system among the different nations as we see today in most countries of the world. Remember, all the package, all the commandments and laws was 613. But it's including the civil law, the moral law, the social law, the economic laws, and religious, because Israel was not only a religion, but was also a state. When finished the era, God organized the Christian church, but not organized the Christian church as a new state. This is a change in the paradigm, in the model. And it's necessary that we know exactly what was the change in the transition from Judaism to Christianity, because many things changed. And it's very important for us to know that. So, in Israel, for example, some of these regulations, for example, a civil regulation, the application of justice, Israel can do it because it was a state, was a nation. Today, the Christian church cannot do it because the Christian church is not a nation. You know, in the Old Testament, when some problem at home, the law was very hard, and sometimes have to kill the boy who was disobedient. We cannot apply those laws today because we are not a state. That issues need to be regulated by every country, dependent. And this is one of the mistakes of the Catholic Church, because Catholic Church is a combination of religion and state. That was okay in the Old Testament, but for the New Testament, God don't agree to do that. God included in his design to Israel a second tithe, which not only supported the annual convocation in Jerusalem. That means if some family have problem to attend the feast in Jerusalem, they can use the second tithe to help the family to go to the feast. You know, that's why the second tithe was administered by the family. And also to help the widow, to help the orphan, the poor, and the stranger. This was in line with love, the main principle and the foundation of the government and the character of God. So you can see the wisdom of God, because the first tithe is showing our love to God, but the second time is showing our love to our neighbors. You know that the law divided in these two principles. Yes, Pastor?
Let me just make a comment. Another great emphasis I see there is education, religious education.
Oh, yes.
Because children, families are supposed to use that money to take their children to the temple.
Oh, yes.
And then once they arrive there, God said, you may choose whatever you want, whatever you like to drink, to eat, and buy it. And I can just think about those children traveling and wondering what they would order once they would arrive in Jerusalem. It would be a unique season in their year. And that money would come from that second tithe.
Yes. And you know why Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem was the holy city. And we have there the holy temple.
I would like to add just one more idea. And these will link their hearts to God. They will associate from childhood God and the temple with good experiences.
Thank you, Pastor. So here is the Israel participation. Now we come into a section that is we need to take very careful. The first tithe is the Levitical tithe, 10%. The second tithe was the feast and charity, 10%, the same. And the offerings, 5%. The total participation of the Jewish families was 25%. Only a few gave more offering and go more than this. This is a quotation written in this year. Now, it's important to know the year, because in 1890 was the church applying now the system of tithe and offerings, systematic benevolence as tithe and offering until today. The contribution required of the Hebrew for religious and charitable purposes amount to fully 1/4 of their income. So heavy attacks upon the resources of the people might be expected to reduce them to poverty. But on the contrary, the faithful observance of this regulation was one of the conditions of their prosperity. And in the next slide, we are going to know why. Yes.
I'm sorry, I did not get where you said you talked about 5% for the maintenance of the sanctuary, the operation of the sanctuary.
In offerings, yes.
What was that source for that? The reference for the 5%?
This one.
That one there.
This is the quotation in Patriarchs and Prof. It said 1/4 of their income.
Okay, so 10.
So you have 10, 10, and 5.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, this is very interesting. Very, very interesting. Look, this was the design, the financial design for families, for the Israel people. And we are going to compare with the modern expenses. In Israel, they don't have to pay nothing for mortgage or rent. 0. Taxes, 0. Education, 0. Because Levite has in charge of the education. Utilities, 0. First time, 10%. Second tithe, 10%. Offering, 5%. So the families remained with 75% of all the income for the food and expenses. Was impossible for a family with a good, success in 1 year to spend all the money in food and other expenses. So every year was a superávit, was an amount of money that they not use it. So in the next one, the next year, increase, and the next increase until the point that Israel become to be a rich nation. And God was mentioned that you will be a rich nation. Now, the God's plan. In this divine plan, God took responsibility for most of the expenses of each family faced. 75% of their income was available for food and general expenses, and it was difficult, as I explained it already. So, in general, Hebrew families grew richer year by year. There was a good plan for giving prosperity to the people, and Israel became a rich family. Now, meanwhile, the second tithe was a blessing because cultivated a noble spirit of benevolence. The principles underlying this system can be adopted and adapted to our time. Also, we recognize that there is no any biblical support to require the practice of the second tithe in the New Testament for the Christian church. The second tithe had the purpose of helping people in need and it was not an additional support for the sanctuary. What that mean? That in the magazine, in the editorial, is some more information about this. But sometimes we are using some quotation, like this one about the second tithe, in order to motivate or to press a little money or more money for the expenses of the church. But my dear leaders, I believe in this design. The church, when began with the financial system, doesn't adopt tithe and offerings. Why? Because all the pioneers were members of the different churches that they don't practice that. They don't want accustomed to that. So they do what the other churches were doing. Financial the church with offerings. But James White, that at that time was editor of the Review and Herald, wrote in 1861 the convenient to explore the concept of tithe. Was not clear at that moment. Was not clear. But James White was at least trying to motivate. In the New Testament, you are not going to find any quotation that said that tithe should be applied for the Christian church. The only reference that you found in the New Testament about tithe is in the ministry of Jesus. But only explaining, the ministry of Jesus was simple clarifying. You hear in the past this and this and this, but now I tell you, with the tithe was the same. In Matthew 23:23, see, you are faithful in tithe, but I explained that you are forgetting the justice and the mercy, and that's what's explaining. But in the transition from Judaism to Christianity, many things of the Old Testament laws and regulations, the Lord assigned the Christian church to decide. That's what the Council of Jerusalem began to work. So how to finance the work in the New Testament? Our Christian church began with offerings, donation. And was, a discussion also in the Christian church about the use of tithe and the use of offering until today. At the middle of 19th century, the year 1850, the Christian church in North America recognized that in order to fulfill the order of the Lord to go to all nations, they need to establish missions out of the country in different nations. But at that time, the Protestant church was receiving in offerings, donation, not enough to support the pastor. How can they open missions in different countries? So some of the writers, not Adventists, began to explore why don't study the design of God for the Israel. Why not consider between 1850 and 1875, the Christian church spent 25 years discussing the issue of tithe. And our pioneers were participating because it was something popular. At the end, a few Protestant church adopted the plan of tithe. Our church adopted 1 year later, 1876. Now, was a very difficult situation. I have only 2 minutes, so I don't have time to explain why it was so difficult for a person to was giving weekly 5 cents weekly. At that time, the salary of the week was $5. So 5 cents was 1 cent, 1%. Now the church is telling, no, it's not the way. You need to give 10%. That increased the 5 cents to 50 cents, 10 times more. It's like that somebody today is giving $200 to the church, and now the pastor says, no, it's 2,000. It's a big. So the members don't accept the plan of tithe immediately. Was a process, was a process. Now, my conclusion, 1 minute. Our church, by faith, adopt the plan of the support the pastoral ministry with 10%, like Israel did it in the Old Testament. 10%. What about second tithe? Well, it's not easy. Today, when we have to pay rent or mortgage and taxes and utilities and secure for cars, secure for property, secure for health, with too many expenses, you are not going to receive 75% for your food and personal expenses. You are going to receive very little. That's why, in this case, what I recommend, begin with any percentage and separate. At the time when you separate the first tithe, separate any percentage for charity. It's your personal charity. It's not, here we are not talking about the corporative charity, but at the personal charity. Maybe 2% or maybe 3%, and every year, according with the relationship with God, maybe can increase 1 point. And for the sanctuary will be a really good plan if every member could also support the church with 5% of their income. That's, yeah. They can select the experience. So, in this case, the percentage for charity, you are going to put in a separate envelope. And when you see a need, you took the money from that envelope. Now, I promised that to the Lord. Said, I'm going to give for charity only until the envelope is empty. Since 1977, 1969 until today, that envelope never is empty because the blessing of the Lord. It's a good plan. Really, it's a good plan. And it's a satisfaction when you can give support to a widow, to a student, to an orphan, to any that really is in need. So this is what I found in my research about this important issue of the second tithe. Thank you very much.